One of the big strategies that we used over and over in the product team was make sure any work that you do manually, you can get more payoff for. Use the demand from a customer, use the manual work that you're doing as an excuse to kind of build the underlying infrastructure and the flexibility that you need in order to be able to remix it and recombine it in much faster, lighter weight ways in the future.
Decision making over the course of the 8 years, what are some of the key decisions that you made that really paid off really well, right? That stand out?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, if I could go back in time and give myself some advice around something, it would be hire a senior management team faster. This is something that we waited a long time to do. We started hiring our exec team in late 2015. It took a long time. We just hired our last kind of key role for our exec team. They started a month ago. So that took 2 years to really flush out a senior leadership team at Zapier. And that is something that we probably should have started years earlier, if I'm being honest with myself. I think that we finally realized, like, hey, yeah, we really need to bring in more senior talent. We had primarily hired out of our user base. We'd primarily hired out of our friends and family, or not family, but friend network and our like user base network. And got to a point where we realized, like, yeah, if we're going to take this next scale, we need folks who've like kind of seen the path forward. We need folks who've seen the next 2 years. This is usually how we thought about exec roles and senior leadership roles, is like try to find people who've seen at least the next 2 years of growth from where you're at today. So if you're 10 people and we're going to bring in a leader, we're hoping that they might, and you're expecting to grow from 10 to call it 50 over the next 24 months. You should probably find somebody who's at least run a 50-person team before, or seen a 50-person team, so that they can pattern match off of what it takes to run that type of organization and bring that experience into your small company for scaling. But yeah, I think that was probably the one big company decision that we made that made a really, really big difference in the trajectory of the company. Maybe one interesting one on the product side. So I mentioned I was a chief product officer for the first 8 years of the company's life. One of the big strategies that we used over and over in the product team was make sure any work that you do manually, you can get more payoff for. Use the demand from a customer, use the manual work that you're doing as an excuse to kind of build the underlying infrastructure and the flexibility that you need in order to be able to remix it and recombine it in much faster, lighter weight ways in the future. Can give you a couple examples of this. In the early days, when we were sitting down to do our pricing and packaging, it was summer 2012. We just launched, I think it was like the weekend before we were going to launch Zapier and TechCrunch. We realized we don't have pricing on the website yet, so we needed to like come up with pricing. So we sat down at a computer and we're like, let's do like the Fibonacci sequence. So our initial pricing was like $11, $23, $57. And Brian's sitting there coding up the pricing thing to do this. And this early decision we made around, okay, we could have just like plugged those things into Stripe at the time and just exposed them on the website. But instead what we did was Brian built this kind of like flexible system where you could have individual price plans that were in a plan group, and when you signed up, you got put in a plan group. Pretty small, easy architectural decision. And we're using Django, so you get this kind of admin interface that you could use to expose it over in the future. We ran, I think, 24 pricing experiments over the next 8 years on top of that same infrastructure. Because one of the advantages it gives you with the plan group is you can grandfather folks in. So when someone's new to signing up, you just put them into a new plan group, and they see new pricing that the previous customers still get access to their old pricing. They don't have to worry about pricing getting changed on them. That allowed basically our marketing team and myself and a product manager to run pricing experiments. We ran, like I mentioned, I think over 20 of them over the next several years, and kind of honed in our pricing without having to have any engineer involved in that. This is kind of just one prototypical example of like a more fundamental philosophy which we've taken in our product, which is like whenever you're going to do a bunch of manual work, just think like, is there a more flexible foundation here that we might be able to, someone who's like non-technical or can't code or might give more power to someone else in the organization to remix this into something new and get like a lot of value out of it over the long run. That engineering time is expensive, so if you can find ways to scale that further, it's almost always in your interest to do so.
Awesome. Yeah, so guys, think of some questions. We're going to open up for questions. Last question I have for you, though, Mike, is the Peter Thiel question. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
Well, this has certainly changed over the last 8 years. 8 years ago, that was like running a remote company is an acceptable way to run a company. When we were raising money back in 2012, we were pitching to VCs, for that first $1 million seed fund, and the things that we got told, frankly, were insulting, right? Like, you will probably experience this too, I'm guessing, maybe in a different way, but like, people literally told us to our face, when are you gonna grow up and be a real company and get an office and raise money? And like, how rude and insulting that that this isn't a valid way to run a business and scale a company. Like, it just kind of blew my mind a little bit. So I think the mentality around Silicon Valley has certainly changed over the last 8 years. Certainly housing prices in the Bay Area don't help there. Now you see a lot more venture capital and kind of the thought leadership of the Valley. Like, it's almost expected that you're going to have some part of your company be remote now, right? Like, I think the kind of running message is hire your leadership team in the Bay Area, but be okay with hiring everyone else outside the Bay Area somewhere else, which actually is pretty good, I think, pretty decent advice. Like, we're kind of similar. The 3 founders are still in the Bay Area, and everyone else is, distributed around the world mostly. But yeah, it's definitely something that is moving more, I think, into the mainstream, but certainly something in the early days was not something that most folks agreed with. Nowadays, as we've grown, I think something that I believe in, automation gets talked a lot about. I think automation often gets talked about a lot about in kind of a negative light in general, and I think it makes sense. Like, I get why. Automation has typically been locked in the hands of folks who are like the decision makers, leadership, management, folks who can deploy capital, folks who have control over like labor. If you look back in time, that's almost been universally true. And I think one of the interesting things about Zapier, and the reason why I'm so passionate, why I'm still working on it, almost a decade after we got started with this company, is I've started to see the other side of that coin, of what kind of benefits you get by actually putting these tools in everybody's hands, right? And I think that's something that we're still, we have over 100,000 customers, but there's 60 million knowledge workers in the US, hundreds of millions of knowledge workers globally. So like, we have a long way to go before I think can say we've made, a big dent or achieved that mission in any way. But I think that there actually is a very positive story to tell about automation, especially when it's democratized and everybody has the ability to do it. If you think about like coding, I'll go back to my story from college, right? So when I did that first $5,000 project, it was eye-opening to realize, wow, this fun side skill that I've been learning for my whole childhood has a ton of value. And coding, at the end of the day, is just automation, right? Like, when you're building products or you're building infrastructure, like, it's all just automating something when you're building software. And I think, we've all seen what kind of economic advantages folks who know how to write software get. Just go look at the salaries and comp and Facebook and Google and Salesforce. Why doesn't everyone have that same economic advantage then? I think that's something that Zapier can actually help with, give that same kind of economic advantage to literally anybody who has some interest in, connecting tools together to get their job done. So, yeah, we still have a ways to go, but that's where we're at today.